Thanks for the warm introduction, Ron, and congratulations for organizing this conference. As Ron mentioned, I'm Terry Thompson from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I lecture on global cyber policy, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion. Russia, China, and Iran are major threat actors in the cyber domain, as we all know, and all three have conducted cyber operations against the United States. Yet each of these countries has unique cyber capabilities, different motivations, and specific goals that drive the use of cyber as an instrument of their foreign and national security policies. In this panel, we will look at the similarities and differences of the worldview of each country and work to establish a context to provide a broader perspective about the cyber threats they pose. Our panel includes 5 talented experts in these countries. Dr. Golfo Alexopoulos is professor and director of the Institute on Russia at the University of South Florida. She is, as her title implies, a specialist on Russia and the former Soviet Union, and she has researched and published extensively, especially on the subject of prison camps and other abuses in Stalin's time. Mr. Tomas Čiponis is a specialist in the Strategic Communications Department of the Lithuanian Armed Forces. One of the roles of strategic communications is to identify and debunk disinformation, and as you may know, Lithuania and its Baltic neighbors have been subjected to Russian disinformation for many decades. Mr. Devin Ellis is a specialist in East Asia who has spent a lot of time in China. He is a policy and research program director for the ICONS project, which is a simulation research and training program at the University of Maryland. Devin has designed simulations to help DoD, the Joint Staff, and military components understand and deal with complex problems. Dr. Barnett S. Coven is the training director, near-peer competition lead researcher, and counterterrorism lead researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. He is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University, an adjunct faculty member of the Joint Special Operations University, and has taught at other military and civilian three-letter departments in the U.S. government. Mr. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a nonprofit research institute in Washington, D.C. that focuses on national security and foreign policy. Behnam is a native Farsi speaker with broad expertise in many aspects of Iran's foreign and security policies, and he is frequently called upon to brief journalists, congressional staff, and other Washington-based audiences. Welcome to you all, and many thanks for joining our discussion today. I'd like to start with a question for all of you. Each of our 3 countries has a unique view of cyberspace and how it can be used as a tool in their national strategy. How do they view cyberspace? How do they use cyber operations in their foreign and national security policy? And how does cyber fit into their warfighting strategy? It's a wide open question, and I look forward to hearing your views. So let's begin with Iran, Behnam, and then move to China and Russia. Behnam, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Terry, for the kind introduction, and to Ron and all the staff for organizing, and all our friends and colleagues here today for sharing the digital panel with me and us here. It's an interesting question because the Islamic Republic's activities in cyberspace, you could say, are an extension of its asymmetric military strategy and an extension of its revolutionary worldview. These things may not on paper bleed together, but in practice they actually do. Here's why. The Islamic Republic is in essence a revolutionary state. It's looking to overturn the regional balance of power, which it believes is supported by an external actor, supported by the United States. It has ideological and strategic competition with the United States, which is increasingly moved into other domains over the past 40 plus years. So it was terrorism, it was military, it was human rights, it was missile, it was nuclear, and then cyber became another domain for the strategic competition to be adjudicated. Now, Iran may not be the savviest cyber actor when compared to some of the other countries that are going to be discussed today, but it certainly has, you could say, a mosaic of capabilities that's leveled against the U.S. as part of this larger asymmetric and warfighting strategy. Some directed by, of course, top levels, the IRGC, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, designated terrorist organization, but also part of the Iranian government. The Ministry of Intelligence and Security, which has had some of its personnel designated for terrorism reasons under European sanctions even. And of course, the vast nexus of Iranian contractors, which, part-time, full-time may support some of these state-level activities to penetrate institutions, engage in, distributive denial of service attacks, other forms of cyber-enabled economic warfare. But most things largely benefit this asymmetric warfighting strategy that Iran has. And just like Iran's investments in other unmanned threats, such as unmanned aerial threats, drones, missiles, and Iran's quest for asymmetric military advantages like terrorism or nuclear, for that matter, cyber is in essence one way where Iran can make a initially low cost and then high return on investments kind of attack. It's one way that Iran can disguise its hand. We all talk about Iranian proxy operations, Iranian militias, Iranian terror sponsoring, not just the Middle East, but across the world. Cyber fits in quite neatly with those existing capabilities as well. And of course, it gets really to the strategic heart, to the strategic brain trust of Iran, which is deterrence by punishment and retaliation. Iran learned the lessons of its conventional military weakness the hard way due to the Iran-Iraq War. This is really the cataclysmic event. It's an 8-year war that really grounded the revolutionary ideology in terms of the real world around it, where it would run up against real red lines for its neighbors, against the U.S. And the military investments it's made since the end of that conflict are really the beginnings of the threats that we've seen from the Islamic Republic to present. So, making up for those conventional military deficiencies, trying to use ideology and zeal where there was a lack of technical capability, trying to outsource things to proxies, being interested in ideological competition away from the homeland, trying to defend the homeland, trying to mask certain attacks, and trying to make things as unmanned as possible. And of course, being again interested in the concept of deterrence by punishment. So when you look at certain cyber campaigns, particularly the brief cyber-enabled economic warfare campaign or the DDoS attacks against U.S. financial institutions from really 2011, 12 to 13, 14, you can really see a trend of trying to do something to deter future U.S. sanctions against Iran or punish the U.S. for engaging in sanctions against Iran. Or you look more recently, of course, at the attacks on critical infrastructure against U.S. partners and allies in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. You see cyber being integrated as really part of Iran's warfighting apparatus. It doesn't mean it treats it as a necessarily distinct domain, but again, it sees cyber as a way for it to punch back, to make up for some of its deficiencies, and I think most importantly, to be able to retaliate and showcase certain capabilities while insulating itself from the kind of kinetic reprisal that it knows it would be having if its covert competition and covert activities were made overt. So it's really consistency and the quest for a capability.
Okay, thank you, Benham. Devin, how about from the Chinese perspective?
Thanks, Terry, and thanks to everyone for organizing the panel. I think there's the thing to understand about the Chinese relationship with the cyber realm is that it plays a multi-layered role in their national security view and strategy. There are, of course, dimensions to it that are where we traditionally think of these things happening in the espionage realm, such as everything from the OPM hacking a number of years ago, where tens of thousands of government employees' data were stolen, through the commercial and scientific espionage that takes place, both against targets within the United States, rarely but more frequently against United States targets that are in China. So that's at one end of the spectrum. But unlike, I think, Russia or Iran, the PRC also has a significant role for cyber as a supporting element in its planning for a potential actual kinetic conflict with the United States. Cyber is a critical part, especially on the electronic warfare spectrum, of China's anti-access area denial doctrine. And so controlling or disabling information space that allows us to coordinate in a sophisticated 21st century manner with ships and aircraft in a actual kinetic conflict with China in, say, the South China Sea or the East China Sea with Japan, for example, would be a component of their actual cyber strategy. And so I think that's maybe a little bit of a differentiator when it comes to Beijing's thinking on cyber versus Moscow's or Tehran's, is this notion that it has to actually be a component of a traditional kinetic conflict for them in a way that it's probably not part of the planning for the other two. The third element that I think is worth bearing in mind when you think about China's overall cyber strategy is that when we talk about the cyber realm, most of the time we're talking about the software aspect. We're talking about the cloud. We're talking about hacking. We're talking about electronic warfare and disruption. But China's also actually attempting to create a hardware advantage. The Huawei controversy in the European Union and the United Kingdom is the illustrative example of this, if you like. We have had to actually go and persuade our allies that at economic cost to them, frankly, because Huawei did and does have advantages in terms of its, movement into the 5G space, that at economic cost to them, for national security reasons, they need to not incorporate this Chinese hardware into their national and international infrastructures. And when you talk about the use of cyber as a plan or part of your national security strategy, the hardware element for China, to me, actually represents a similar line of thinking to the way Beijing has moved to replace the post-World War II international security and economic structures in other ways as well. So you can think of it from a policy perspective for them as being analogous to trying to get the renminbi as a basket currency for benchmarking, along with the dollar, for example, in economic markets. But of course, in a tactical operational space, having potentially compromised infrastructure supporting an entire global communications network also represents a serious national security vulnerability. So whether that's Beijing's principal reason for wanting to do this or not, it's impossible to say, but it's certainly something that has become a significant dimension of their relationship with cybersecurity policy around the world. And I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Devin. We're blessed on this panel to have three Russia experts. Let's start with Barnett and then Golfo and then hear from Tomas.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Terry, thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to the organizers at USF. So Russia, like China, although distinct from the US, does not view the cyber domain as indeed a distinct domain. Indeed, if you look at sort of Russian literature, they don't tend to use terms like cyber or cyber warfare, except, of course, in reference to Western conceptions of these issues. Instead, you tend to see a term, informatization. And so in essence, for Russia, cyber is not a distinct domain, but it is merely a component of the information warfare domain, right? Cyber is therefore a tool or a means through which to dominate the information landscape. That said, cyber and the larger sort of information warfare domain are extremely important to Russia today. And so the Kremlin, I believe, is seeking to return Russia to a position of prominence on the world stage. Yet in doing so, it's faced with both a deteriorating demographic future, and it's also constrained by a resource-based economy. And this precludes the requisite investments in its conventional forces necessary to achieve great power status on the basis of its conventional military capabilities. And here, by the way, I see a similarity with Iran. And of course, as already mentioned, its limited economic base probably similarly forestalls following in China's footsteps and leaning heavily into its economic levers of influence. Information warfare, and cyber-enabled information warfare in particular, however, allows Russia to punch way above its conventional military and economic weight class. And for that reason, I think it's extremely important to sort of Kremlin thinking on these issues. And so by leveraging tried and true Soviet approaches to influence and operations in the information environment, albeit in combination with novel 21st century cyber tools that simultaneously massively magnify the effect of these information operations while decreasing the cost and making them harder to defend against, Russia is able to impose massively asymmetric costs on its targets, whether those be countries in its near abroad or the United States. Moreover, I think because Russian leaders are aware of their dismal economic and demographic future, they likely understand that they are unlikely to be better positioned to achieve their desired geopolitical end states over the long term than they are now. And consequently, we see Russian leadership demonstrating both considerably less risk aversion in engaging in cyber competition, whether this is disinformation or, on the other end of the spectrum, sort of cyber physical attacks. And whereas Beckman, for example, referred to sort of Iran's strategy of deterrence by punishment, I think Russia's strategic aims and how they employ cyber goes quite a bit further beyond simply deterrence to strategically offensive engagements. Just sort of one final point that I think sort of dovetails nicely with some of Devin's discussion about using cyber as part of a kinetic military approach to fighting the United States. Certainly, I agree with Devin's contention that Russia isn't looking for a conventional fight with the U.S. necessarily, and hasn't invested nearly as much as China has in planning for leveraging cyber as part of that fight. That said, Russia does use cyber-enabled information warfare and operations in the influence environment to prepare the battlefield when they do engage in kinetic fights. We saw this in Ukraine, in places like the Donbass in the east, as well as in Georgia, where this played a pretty heavy role. But nevertheless, I do agree with Devin's broader point, and I think importantly and increasingly, Russia is employing cyber tools from disinformation to election meddling to cyber attacks, including cyber physical attacks, in order to try and achieve objectives without resorting to armed competition. Either way, though, Russian cyber is designed to disorganize, distract, divide public opinion, or otherwise reduce the resolve in the target country or the target population. I think since we have two other Russia SMEs on this panel, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Barnett. Golfa, what would you add to that discussion?
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you to Ron Sanders and Cyber Florida for pulling together this wonderful conference. I would only add that I think that there's a really critical similarity between Russia and Iran in the sense that both view themselves as kind of these revolutionary regimes. Begum mentioned that Iran uses cyber to push its ideological agenda. I do think that in recent years under Putin, he very much sees himself as fighting this war with the West. So cyber is a tool that Russia uses in its larger war with the West to discredit the Western liberal democratic order, to sow chaos, but also to advance Russia's identity as the bearer of white Christian, all that isn't decadent Western civilization. So I think that they see cyber as very much a key to their propaganda efforts, and propaganda has always been a part of warfare that goes, back to Lenin. Lenin believed that that war is just politics through other means, and propaganda was very much a part of the Soviet project, and there wasn't a clear distinction in the Soviet era, certainly during the Cold War, between traditional combat and propaganda combat or non-traditional forms of conflict. So I think that has just persisted. Putin is very much a product of the Soviet system, and especially since say 2011, 2012, when he dealt with domestic opposition, and we can talk about that later, I think he's viewed cyber as really important to advancing his ideological agenda.
Okay, thank you, Golfo. Tomasz, you've studied a lot of Russian and Soviet doctrine. How does the cyber domain fit into their warfighting strategies?
Yes, thank you. I also would like to add that cyber is one of the tools in the hybrid toolbox of Russia. And if we look broadly in their open internal document and policies, we can find that almost in all documents there is a mentioning about some usage of cyber activities. And this is not only in the documents. Definitely we know structures. We know that in some special intelligence agencies and also in the military level, there is special units created. Also, we're using different support from hired hackers in order to do some specific activities. So for us, it's clear evidence that it's already understood that it's a really valuable tool, and they are using it in real life. So Russia is one of the countries which are allowing themselves to do real cyber activities, real disinformation and propaganda, info-war activities against our countries. Also, what we can see and what is evidence for us that we're using it, let's say, in relation with other hybrid tools, that last year, main part of informational operation in our country was cyber information operation. So this is like in cyber activities in conjunction with other possible tools, energy sector, informational sector, political domain. And also during the big military exercises which are organized by Russia, we all the time see that there is increase in cyber activities. So again, for us, it's show that cyber domain, this is like a part of military training, but they are doing it not theoretically, they are doing this training inside our countries. And also similar with China, they also trying to do their activities on software level. It's pretty difficult for them on the hardware level, but as you know, we are using Google services. They are trying to push their national products like Yandex package, and also some other social media programs like we are using Facebook, Twitter. They also do their own. They are trying to create their own social software. And also, what is worth mention that they are very active in protecting their internal cyber environment. There are plenty of different changes in the policies, also some specific action on the software and the hardware level. And for us, Western countries, bring our communication inside Russia, it's a really challenge. And this is like, we are playing the same game by different rules. They are visible and they are allowed to do their activities inside our countries, but each year it's more and more difficult to bring our communication inside Russian informational domain, even through cyber environment.
Thank you, Tomasz. So it's pretty clear from those discussions that each of these countries has a slightly different view of the cyber domain and how they use cyber in their strategies, and particularly in Russia's case as part of their information warfare fighting strategy. It's also interesting that China, Iran, and to a large extent Russia is doing these kinds of cyber operations just up to the verge of, but not going into an area where they might suffer a kinetic response from the US, NATO, or other targeted countries. So to me anyway, that raises the question of whether there are or might be some domestic policy considerations in how these countries view their cyber strategies and cyber in their worldview. So let me just open it up for discussion and see who would like to talk about in any of the countries what you think might be the domestic policy considerations that drive their use of cyber operations. Golfo, did I see your hand?
So I think the domestic sphere really plays an important role here because the tools that the Kremlin has used against domestic opponents, it then exported. So these are many tools that were first used against domestic, the democratic opposition within Russia. So in the Kremlin's eyes, the colored revolutions in Georgia and in Ukraine, the Arab Spring, these are all Western CIA manufactured events. And that Russia is next. And Russia views its information operations as self-defense. Of course, this is how everything is framed by the Kremlin, but in particular, it began really ramping up its information operations following the Bolotnaya protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, when Putin came back for a third term and faced a lot of domestic opposition. And then those tools then he used in Ukraine. So I do think that what's happening domestically is extremely important. I think this desire to have internet sovereignty is also a direct response to dissent that he's dealing with. And to pick up on a point that Barnett raised earlier, it's because he doesn't have any other prospects. He can't promise the public, economic growth or any other opportunities. He creates this enemy of the West trying to undermine not just him, but Russian civilization. So I think the domestic politics and his fear of losing power is very important to this conversation.
Thanks. Devin, in your overview, you talked about the third dimension on the spectrum of cyber operations in China, and that being to create a hardware advantage, which suggests there's an economic policy component to their whole view of cyber. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, Terry. And if you want to, look outwardly, I think that they would love to see, I keep picking on Huawei, but let's just say that they would like to see Chinese hardware infrastructure as it's a component of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That, if you can drive through Kazakhstan on a highway built with Chinese asphalt, then you should also be collecting your cell phone signal from towers using Chinese technology the whole way that you're doing it, right? So that is clearly part of their economic policy. But I also want to tag on, what Golfo was just saying about the internet sovereignty issue. China was, if you like, a world leader in this front. The Great Firewall was a thing long before this became the most, critical part of cyber defense, cyber sovereignty. I remember many years ago when I was living in Beijing, there were, half a dozen websites that you couldn't go to, right? The BBC, anything related to the government of Taiwan. And even then, they were innovating on the domestic front with the use of cyber and related technology tools, right? If you had a cell phone in the early aughts that was on a Chinese network, then they knew where your general municipality area was. And we used to get these text messages to everybody who had a cell phone in Beijing that would say, there will be a protest at the Japanese embassy about imperialism tomorrow at 4 p.m. Please go there, right? They literally, it was that blunt a tool for them. And there is speculation now about exactly how large the core of people employed by the Ministry of State Security are, who just troll the enclosed Chinese internet space looking for dissent and counter posting and all of that. But the even conservative estimates, obviously, is in the neighborhood of about 20 to 30,000 people. And so there's the element of domestic information control has always been critical to the CCP. And the more technically savvy they get at it, and the more they are able to control and close their system, the more enabled they become to create this other fantasy universe, right? And unlike with Putin, I think they don't view it as a replacement for having to deliver on economic security or national security goals for them. They clearly, the CCP still, ironically, for a communist party, ties its legitimacy with its population largely to the continuous delivery of economic success for the country. Excuse me. However, it certainly helps if you can also be controlling the internal conversation in your population. They do get nervous. Barnett likes a story that I tell about a panel I was on a few years back where we were talking about the Chinese defense budget, and somebody asked how much time we thought the Standing Committee of the Politburo spends worrying about their defense budget, and the answer from very smart colleague was probably not that much, because if you are running China, mostly you get up in the morning and all you worry about all day is the idea of 500 million starving peasants, right? We think about how advanced parts of the country are, but the reality is there's also still something like 33% of the population is still living on subsistence agriculture, right? So that's crazy when you think about a modernized, largely industrial country, a country that's competing with the United States on national defense issues, a country that's sending satellites into space, a country that is trying to overtake, the international banking system, and yet they have this problem. And so that internet sovereignty issue, I predict that they will continue to drive that. And unfortunately, it does look like we are broadly headed down a road where in the next decade there will be two internet infrastructures, one built on Chinese technology and the other one built on Western technology.
Exactly right. And just to underscore that point, right now at the International Telecommunication Union, a Chinese delegation is presenting a proposal for a change in the TCP/IP protocol that underlies and is the foundation for the global internet. They have a different approach that they want to propose, and if accepted, could lead exactly to what you talked about, an American internet and a Chinese internet. And I don't think we're totally prepared for that.
And it's going to be Sir Tim Berners-Lee's world of the World Wide Web, right? And then a closed system available to anyone who's interested in the Chinese model. And as Golfa was saying, Putin has clearly figured out that the Chinese model is the better one if you're going to run an authoritarian regime.
Thank you. Benham, you had implied earlier in your comments about some domestic considerations in Iran's thinking about cyber. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. There's actually a lot to kind of piggyback off of, particularly on the Russian element of the conversation here. But it's that, the Iranians, particularly the government of the Islamic Republic, is cognizant of recent history. Khamenei thinks, who's the supreme leader, by the way, he thinks in exactly the same terms as Golfa was mentioning, which is the fear of these velvet revolutions, the fear of these color revolutions. And in fact, there's a word that is probably used more often than the word cyberspace or the cyber domain in Iranian national security discourse. And you hear hard men using this soft term, and it is really about the soft war. So the word is soft war, but it's something that's associated with it is tahajjum farhangi, cultural invasion. Iranians are cognizant of the role of technology in facilitating the flow of information, which has facilitated major social and political movements in their past history. Just a few days ago was Persian New Year, Nowruz. It became the year 1400, the new century. Really, the past century, when you look at the role technology has played in propelling Iranian social movements forward, it's amazing. Just before the past century, you had the Iranian tobacco revolts in the 1860s. Telegrams and were used to really get around that, meaning the typing of these little I forgot what the actual tool is, but like sending telegrams between Iran and Iraq to get fatwas out against concessions that at that point the monarchy was giving. Newspapers were instrumental in the constitutional revolution, 1905, 1911, as well as in the 51-53 oil nationalization crisis. So was radio then. The 1979 revolution was called the Cassette Revolution because Khomeini's sermons were smuggled in on cassettes. Some people even called it the Xerox Revolution because you could print some of these sermons and distribute them to places where the papers had a high degree of censorship. 2009, the Green Movement, everyone knows about that, was called the Twitter Revolution. Twitter and the social media space was beginning to be used by both sides. You saw really in the past decade and a half, a proliferation of Iranian social media activity as in the early 2000s, they left blogs, which was the main feature of the performance movement, and they moved on to social media platforms like Twitter. But you also saw Iranian government officials and Iranian government personnel and fans of Iranian government personnel and the small hardline minority of the population develop pages on restricted social media websites, develop Facebook pages, Instagram pages, Telegram pages, Twitter pages, and other kind of social media platform pages to be able to combat the narrative, to inject our partisan politics with their worldview, as well as the partisan politics of lots of different accounts, because some of these folks, such as Khamenei, have Twitter accounts or foreign language media accounts in several languages. And of course, to be able to monitor what's going on their own platforms. So, Iran is looking at the China model with a lot of interest. And it's no surprise that Iran is also looking at the Russians for potential cyber defenses as well. Iran's government is highly reactive. It responds to a threat, absorbs the punishment, and tries to respond in kind. That's the story of Stuxnet. That's the story of Iran's ballistic missile program. That's the story of a lot, but not all, but a lot of the threats that the Islamic Republic is able to pose. Learn from something, try to reinvent it as you go along, and that's really why I use the word mosaic when we're talking about Iran's cyber warfare capabilities, because you do have this issue of state versus non-state actors, contractors. Most of those contractors are externally focused, but you have the actual regime assets, the Iranian government assets, prioritizing the domestic threat, because even though some of these folks are getting up in the morning saying death to America, death to Israel, death to the Saudis, firing ballistic missiles with these slogans inscribed on them, the threat that concerns them the most is the domestic threat. It's, the fact that the Iranian domestic political spectrum has contracted significantly in the past 4 decades means that there's been a significant chasm between state and society. The 1979 revolution was a popular revolution, but really ever since that revolution, there's been tons of protests against the state. In 2017 to 20, which is really ironically under a peak period of foreign pressure, you had the most widespread and the most significant protests and the most violently repressed protests, and protests that were violently repressed under the cover of internet darkness, 6-7 day internet blackouts on a near national level across the country. It should signal to us, watching from abroad, the linkage that the regime sees between the Iranian people's ability to freely access information and the threats that the regime faces. The regime knows it's unpopular. The regime knows it invests money in areas that the population doesn't agree with. And it knows that really what it's going to be able to have to do if it wants to stay in power is not just to be aggressive abroad and offset these, perceived American or Israeli threats, but it is actively trying to restrict the freedom of information and the free flow of information between Iranians themselves inside the country and between Iranians and the outside world. And that's why you have things like the Halal Internet Initiative, a real attempt to try to copy China and block off Iran or from being able to be fully connected to the real global internet. You have Iranian attempts to spoof popular social media platforms and create their own versions, using adherence to these social media platforms as a measure of an individual's social cachet. It's not quite developed as the Chinese model, but if you sign up for an Iranian version of Facebook rather than Facebook itself, that may potentially give you some benefits down the line. This is still kind of a crypto or proto thinking, but nonetheless, because there is this chasm between state and society, the actual government apparatus has been focusing on domestic repression and using cyber to target opposition, dissidents, and people that they haven't managed to kill or exile. They're able to harass, monitor, surveil, trick, use spear phishing tactics, some pretty primitive stuff and some pretty advanced stuff. And again, use a mosaic of capabilities to entrap, hinder, thwart domestic opposition, prevent protests, attack protests from different vectors, expose certain protesters, and really these are, if it's projected abroad, projected at the U.S., you would call these, nefarious tools of statecraft. But these are, I have a former colleague who talks about statecraft and soulcraft. These are authoritarian tools of soulcraft. The Iranian government believes that these people are rebelling because they have been subject to cultural invasion, because the Iranian government does see some of these protesters as fifth columns. That's absolutely, obviously preposterous and untrue, but that's what comes with this coarsening of the regime ideology in the past 4 decades and the contraction of the political system in the past 4 decades. If power is to be preserved, this is the kind of tools that the Iranian government is investing in to not just be aggressive abroad, but be repressive at home. And it's that linkage, that knowing where your conventional deficiencies are and operating below the threshold for the use of force abroad, but keeping a certain series of capabilities onshore to make sure that you can fight to live another day. And it really is, it really is, in fact, scary, given the fact that they see linkages between, I'm an Iranian American, obviously, but they see linkages between Iranians at home and Iranians in the diaspora. These are prime targets. Iranians in the diaspora are subject to tons of spear phishing and account spoofing attacks. So there is this issue that the Iranian government has here, and obviously it's not going away. So they're investing more in this capability to try to offset, thwart, and crack the Iranian people's use of this latest medium, social media, for instance, to be able to organize, have a free flow of information. And I think this trend is likely to continue. And if one thing is blocked, they'll likely get to the other. But I think a real game changer could be the development of this halal internet, the real walling off. Because you could have what the regime did in November 2019 happen more consistently and on a longer basis. And that really is scary.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I love your comment that aggressive abroad and repressive at home. I think that's a good summary for all 3 of these countries and how they use cyber. Barnett, did you have some comments to add here?
Yeah, I completely agree with all 3 of the sort of past interventions in response to this question. But I think there's sort of just 2 threads I'd like to pull out a little bit further. The first related to sort of some of Golfo's points. And I think it can be sort of instructive of thinking about sort of historical insecurities or even paranoia within sort of Russian leadership. And right, Russia has a very long history of invasion, right? They've been invaded, I don't know the precise number offhand, but it's in the double digits, going all the way back to, I think, 1223 with the Mongol invasion. So that's a 900-year history of this. So at first, these were sort of territorial invasions. Eventually, it was airspace violations by the Luftwaffe during the Second World War and the U.S. and NATO air forces during the Cold War. But today, I think there's a perceived threat of an invasion, if you will, that comes through the internet and animates sort of a domestic unrest that infects their domestic population. And I think we see this thinking amongst sort of Russian senior leadership really clearly in this episode that played out a few years ago about the so-called Gerasimov doctrine. And I say so-called because it really wasn't a Russian doctrine. But also, I think it was really misinterpreted in the West, right? We read this speech that was turned into an article in the Military Industrial Courier by the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, Valery Gerasimov, and we read it in the West, or at least many of us did, as, okay, this is the blueprint for Russian offensive, not just cyber, but hybrid warfare, involving a large cyber component. And in fact, that's not at all what Gerasimov was saying. What Gerasimov is saying is this is a tool that the West has used to subvert sort of closed or authoritarian regimes. And as Golfa was saying, it was influenced via social media perpetrated by the US government, and specifically CIA, but others as well. Hillary Clinton calling up Twitter and telling them to delay updates during the Arab Spring since it was being used to organize. And that's what led to the overthrow of seemingly deeply entrenched authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and also much closer to Russia and their near abroad during the Culture Revolutions. So I really do think this all stems from sort of or is an extension of a historic paranoia about invasion and about violations of Russian sovereignty. And so I think that sort of domestic consideration and regime survival definitely animates the Kremlin's thinking in a similar way that Devin and Beckbaum were talking about in China and Iran. And Terry, in introducing, just taking this one step further, in introducing this question, you noted that Russia has used cyber pretty aggressively, but stopped short of providing the West a clear sort of casus belli and in order to engage in a kinetic shooting war, to avoid that level of escalation. And I think that's also really important from a sort of domestic standpoint. We know from really great public opinion data during the Second Chechen War that the Russian public shares a high degree of casualty aversion that political scientists have long recognized in democratic publics, in the US, for example, since at least the Vietnam conflict, but that also exists in authoritarian regimes. And I think Putin's really, really aware of that and has tried to restrict domestic access to information, in particular about Russian casualties in places where they're fighting overseas, like Ukraine, like Syria, for fears that this could be leveraged as part of an operation in the information environment to really galvanize widespread domestic popular unrest against his regime. And we've seen a number of concrete actions in that vein that I'm happy to go into later if anyone's interested, but I think I'll pause there and make sure Tomas has a chance to interject if he chooses.
Thank you, Barnett, and thank you all. What I'm hearing is, the internal domestic uses of cyber operations are as important, perhaps even more important in some ways, than the external uses of cyber. And that brings us to, I think, a discussion about another key aspect of cyber operations, and that is disinformation and information operations. We've all read the recent report from the Director of National Intelligence that talked about information operations conducted by Russia and Iran against the 2020 presidential election. And according to this same report, China did not attempt to interfere either by hacking or injecting disinformation into the process. So I'd like to hear a little bit about your thoughts on the motivations for each country and how and why China was different. And I'd like to ask Tomas to lead us off because in Lithuania, you all have been subjected to Russian disinformation for many, many years. And I know you've got some creative and innovative ways of thinking about it and dealing with it. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you to go ahead and share some of that with us.
Yes, thank you. I would start that we still think that Russia is doing better in the field of disinformation and propaganda, in informational activities, information confrontation than we in our country, and also I think in other Western countries. Not because they are clever, but simply because they are smart and they never stop these activities from Soviet Union times, and even I would say from Tsarist Russia times. We thought that maybe in the 90s Russia were moving towards democratic direction, but actually we were wrong. They simply use this specific opportunity to send more influence agents and more propaganda activities to Western countries. And also, we in the Western countries and in my country, we think that maybe we'll do some little steps, maybe we'll allocate some specific personnel, and maybe we spend a very small part of our budget, and after these activities, we will be more successful in this, let's say, activities, but this is not really true. And we already see more and more Russian informational presence in our country. So it shows that our small steps, they are not giving enough results in order to protect our informational environment. And pretty often we discuss why Russia use these activities and why they put so much effort on these activities. Probably the easiest answer would be that this is what they can do. For them, it's very difficult to compete with European Union on the economical level. For them, it's very difficult to compete with NATO on pure military activities. And so that's why they are using these old and already tested tools. And it looks like it's more useful for them. We know that all these visible pure military activities, as in Balkans, as in Afghanistan, Iraq, actually later on it's very difficult to solve all these issues, even if you are taking, let's say, lead in these specific regions. Also, it's cheaper, so they can afford these tools and they can afford these activities. It's not so sophisticated as nuclear weapons. It's not so sophisticated as some other specific activities. So again, they can do it. And it's, I think a very important point is that it's harder to recognize. For example, in our countries, we look at Sputnik and RT channels as pure propaganda, as a pure weapon of disinformation and propaganda. But in some other countries, farther from our region, as Russia calls close abroad, plenty of people and even politicians, they look at these tools as completely normal tools. So it's already for us show that they do understand how to operate in this field. And we in the Western countries and some other countries farther from Russia, we already forgot about propaganda and disinformation. This is something about Second World War, but not about 21st century. And definitely our prime area, which we would like to protect, it's our national target audiences. But it's really not so easy because we are in NATO, because we are in European Union. So it's very important what kind of information about our country receive our partners, and also what kind of information about them we are receiving in our country. So defense of Western information environment, it's again crucial. How we can take a common decision if we are getting information from completely different sources. And definitely Russia knows how to exploit the vulnerabilities of democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and many, many other ways, even influence of our democratic elections. Only after information and investigation about possibility that Russia influence president election in the United States of America, only when we in Europe started pretty openly discuss and do different investigation and reports about these activities. Before that, we thought that it's a completely normal democratic practice. If somebody has money, if somebody is ruling some specific, as they call media channels, but we call them propaganda channels, it's, yes, this is their ability and rights to influence our elections. So definitely now we change, let's say, our attitude. And era of social media started then. So even now, even more difficult to protect election. Even if, for example, before the election we have silence procedures inside our country, it means completely nothing because through Russian TV channels and other tools, they can do still communication about some specific political issues. And so yes, I believe that in our countries we really need to put more effort. We need to put some specific structures in the, let's say, place, and we need to encourage cooperation between different countries. We already recognize that if Russia succeeds with some specific information operation in one other area, later on they are repeating this information operation in some other countries. So by sharing information, we can even anticipate their future information operation in some specific areas. And our model in Lithuania, let's see how to deal with it. It's I think for the democratic country, it's very important that all country, all society would be involved in these activities. If we do these activities only from a governmental level, they very easy start, let's say, communication that this is only your government, but all your society have completely other opinion. So, we think that our citizens, they're supposed to be informed about these challenges. They need to understand how to live in 21st century information environment. Later on, we do expect a lot of activities and effort from our journalist community, also business. As we know, media channels and social media platforms, they are in private hands. But without cooperation with them, it's very difficult to achieve something very visible and strong results. And definitely government have plenty of responsibilities, but I believe the strongest tool is working with law system. Information environment changes so quickly, so we need to adapt our law system and make these changes in, let's say, our system in order to be quick and follow changes in the information environment. And NATO and European Union also, we do expect that there is understanding that they have their information and space environment, so definitely they're supposed to protect it. And by cooperating in this, let's say, organization, definitely we can achieve results much quicker and these results be, let's say, stronger.
That's an excellent point. And just to underscore what you said, I believe that the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence does an excellent job, along with your organization in the Lithuanian military, to share information and publish reports about Russian and other disinformation efforts around the world. I'm an avid reader of their work, and I think they're far ahead of the effort we have in the U.S. in some ways to get that information out to the public and make people aware of the threat.
Terry, can I ask Tomas a quick question?
Sure.
I was just going to say, actually picking up on the thread that you just introduced about the Stratcom Center of Excellence, I think I often wonder if coordinated multinational efforts are nimble enough to be effective in the information, warfare environment. And so quickly, if you have any thoughts about not just the efficacy of the NATO Stratcom COE that's in Riga, but in fact, if it matters in a more macro sense that NATO has chosen to put its Stratcom COE in Riga, to put its cyber COE in Estonia, or are these perceived in the Baltic states as effective communications of NATO's commitment to fighting on this information warfare front in the Russian border area? Just a question for you.
Yeah, I do believe that it's very important overall for our region and also for, let's say, getting knowledge and understanding about this issue. I think it's a very important signal sign for Russian side that all your activities in these fields, cyber, informational, energy sector, is visible, and we track you and we analyze you and we understand what is your aim and what you're trying to achieve. But definitely this organization, this is like organization in order to get knowledge and later on share this knowledge. This is not command and control, let's say, centers. Definitely we do anticipate and we already do see some specific steps taken by some NATO HQs, and definitely some specific positions are created and some specific officers they are assigned for, let's say, specific activities in order to understand what is happening in, let's say, this environment and what steps NATO can take in order to be successful in this region. But later on, I believe that overall, we need to have impression and understanding what is happening in the information environment. for which NATO and European Union are responsible.
Great, thank you. Golfo, I know you've given a lot of thought to Russian disinformation. Could you share some of that thinking with us, please?
Yes, I'll do so in a way that picks up on some of the points that have been mentioned. First, Barnett mentioned the war in Chechnya. I just want to say that Putin came to power at a time when the fighting in Chechnya was being renewed, and he was making the argument to go back in there. And over the next few years, he really cracked down on independent media. So his view was that independent media, it was caused the Russian public to turn against the war in Chechnya. And so by cracking down on independent media and controlling the reporting from Chechnya, he was able to shape the narrative. So that was very much a part of his thinking, and it informed and helped develop how he viewed information and the necessity of controlling it. So over the next few years, one of his first initiatives upon becoming president of Russia was to crack down on media. On Begum's point about the fifth column, this is really striking, the way that people who express dissent in these authoritarian countries, the way in which they're perceived as Western implants and fifth columns. I think that's super important because it deprives them of any agency. This is how they view their population. So I think that's really important. So on Russian disinformation, they see the West as very vulnerable, when we are very vulnerable. To pick up on Tomas's point, we are very vulnerable. We see, if a cable provider wants to not carry RT, that's viewed as censorship. Or if people might argue that that's censorship, whereas it's just self-defense, really. And I think that that's something we really have to be careful about. I'll just say one thing very quickly about Russian tactics. They micro-target different populations in the United States. They understand what our vulnerabilities are. They understand that African Americans, for example, have certain long-held, grievances based on their lack of civil rights, and they exploit that. They've targeted the African American community quite aggressively. They did so in 2016 and in 2020, even creating entire Facebook pages and communities specifically for African Americans. They do that with Christian groups. They do that with, the far right and the far left. So I think that it's something that we have to be really aware of. And I totally agree with the point that Tomas made about educating people. People just aren't aware of how much this goes on, and how much they're targeted. So I think that is really important. One final point about NATO that I want to make. At USF, we hosted virtually the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, and he made the point that NATO has recently said that that cyber attacks could be perceived as a conventional attack that would trigger Article 5, and that they would not preclude that possibility. So I think that the use of cyber, as has been said, it's cheap, it's easy, it's effective, and we're vulnerable.
Thank you, Golfo. I want to come back to that NATO comment a little bit later on, but continuing for now on the disinformation theme. Benham, I don't know about you, but I was surprised to see in that report that Iran had interfered or tried to in the 2020 presidential election. Of course, we know all about the Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. That's been studied and documented extremely well. I'm just wondering about the motivations and what Iran thought they might accomplish by cyber operations or disinformation in the 2020 presidential election. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's an excellent point because it's a relatively new aspect of the cyber warfare capabilities of Iran. Whether you want to ascribe that directly to the Ministry of Intelligence or Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or contractors who are affiliated with research centers tied to government tied universities, that part should be explored further. But what is clear is that Iran itself, like many of the other revisionist powers, has been watching our domestic politics. And our domestic politics, not just for the past 4 years, but really for the past decade, you could say, have been very public. Our domestic politics have been very public, and as Golfa was mentioning, and I know as people like Barnett have mentioned before, our domestic politics as well as our method of government are ripe for exploitation. Information operations could make a dent in the way that we adjudicate debates, given that we are an open system. The Iranians, yes, compared to the Russians, are relatively late to the game, relatively minor footprint compared to what the Russians purportedly could be developing or have been developing. But here, I think the Iranians getting involved in 2020 didn't surprise me as much because in 2018 they were involved too. We're talking about how these partisan debates are very public. You know, the Iranian government is different from China and Russia in the sense that there has been little to no direct U.S.-Iran contact until the advent of the JCPOA. And this point cannot be underestimated when it comes to Iranian national security thinking. Now, that doesn't mean that because of the JCPOA regime, elites now all of a sudden understand all the nuances of American domestic politics, but they have become increasingly, anyway, risk-tolerant actors. So they're willing to exploit potential avenues that they may see coming through them through different information sources, coming through them in tech, coming through them at the media, that they believe could help bolster a certain narrative. And what we've seen in 2018 and 2020 is that the Iranian cyber attempt has focused on one faction of the U.S. body politic, what you could call the progressive left, in relatively sharp contrast to some of the Russian operations, which you could say kind of focused on the alt-right. And I know I used the wrong hands for left and right, but that's okay. And in this instance, it's because that this hacking endeavor understands that a certain group which harbors a certain domestic disposition is likely to harbor a corresponding foreign policy dovishness towards that target country. Now, that doesn't absolve the right of being not dovish on Iran, or that doesn't mean that only doves on the left exist on Iran, but it was Iran's perception that if you are progressive at home, you're relatively anti-sanctions or anti-pressure on the Islamic Republic abroad. And the regime's understanding of that correlation and the regime's linkage of that correlation to electoral outcomes doesn't mean that this was some kind of seismic endeavor. It was trying to spoof accounts, amplify certain narratives, but it really could be the beginning of a much larger Iranian interest in this space if our domestic politics continue to go this way, and if the debates over foreign involvement continue to be as politicized, if hawkish or dovish or policy towards Iran continues to be described, even as I mistakenly may have done now, as purely hawkish or purely dovish and not commensurate with the threat and the capabilities and the intentions of that threat actor. So in 2018 and 2020, yes, Iran did get involved. What they were doing was spoofing accounts, trying to amplify narratives, trying to get a larger coalition against what is called the maximum pressure campaign, which again is tied to Donald Trump, who is a Republican. But beyond that, I think they understand our electoral politics have sharp cleavages, and those sharp cleavages represent the sharp cleavages in our society. And people who tend to have very strong views on certain subjects may have very strong views on foreign policy. And as they said in 1968, the whole world is watching. The Iranians are watching too.
Thank you. And Devin, the DNI report mentioned that China, for whatever reason, did not attempt to interfere in the election. Is this tied to some of their overall strategic thinking about cyber, or for some other reason?
Really excellent question, Terry. And I'm not going to pretend that I can offer an authoritative answer to what Beijing's thinking was here. But I'll offer a few thoughts based on, generally Chinese approaches to things. The first element is that as much as we talk about their forward-leaning posture in their commercial diplomacy, their military activities in their own near abroad, so to speak, and a lot of other ways, I believe they're genuinely not particularly sophisticated operationally when it comes to the information operations environment. On the hacking side, the hardware side, the software side of cybersecurity issues, clearly they're a leading player. But ironically, for a government and a party that has developed 60, 70 years of sophisticated propaganda against their own population, they are neither particularly proactive nor particularly interested in doing it elsewhere, right? And so I can't help but think that a component of that is their trepidation in working in this sophisticated information operations environment. They're happy to interfere in Taiwanese elections. I mean, you can't get elected dog catcher in a village in Taiwan without, the CCP hacking your Facebook account. But they didn't want to play. And the other part, and this is purely a personal observation from my long interaction with their military intelligence apparatus, is that to an extent that we perhaps don't appreciate, I think a lot of people in their system at many levels do genuinely hold a belief that they were wronged by Western interference, the century of humiliation thing, and that's actually really an inappropriate way to behave, to interfere in another country's domestic politics. And so at the risk of sounding contrary to a lot of the current narratives, I wouldn't rule out the notion that maybe part of it is that no one in that system said, go do this, because it's just not how they act, right? They're more than happy to do coercive diplomacy around whether or not Nicaragua recognizes Taiwan diplomatically, but that's very upfront, and it's in a sort of approved environment. It's in the diplomacy box, and they're happy to be aggressive and coercive in that box. And again, there's an intelligence apparatus side that's doing things like, the famous 61398 unit in the PLA that is hacking OPM and things like that. But it's an intelligence collection operation. It's not an information warfare operation. And I don't know. I could be completely wrong, and it's a bit of a quixotic opinion, but I do think that it shouldn't be ruled out that at certain levels of the leadership chain of command there, because the Ministry of State Security doesn't really they do humans, but they mostly do cyber inside China, not outside China. So most of the outside stuff is PLA stuff. And, I know some of these folks, they're relatively senior uniformed officers who genuinely hold these beliefs that it's inappropriate to interfere in another country's domestic politics, in part because they were raised to believe that their country was a mess because other people had interfered in their domestic politics.
That's a really interesting perspective, probably thought-provoking for a lot of people, but I find it very insightful and ties in with sort of their culture and the DNA of their history. So very interesting.
If I could have just 30 more seconds, I'll say something. A gentleman who I've worked with in that infrastructure. I was in his office a number of years ago. He has got a Japanese officer's dress issue samurai sword from World War II hanging on his wall. And I said, what? Like what? Why? what is that, and why is it hanging on your wall? And it was a sword that belonged to one of the commanding officers at the rape of Nanking, and he bought it at an auction, and he hung it on his wall and said, because I'm never going to forget what happened, right? So that's the culture that permeates some of the senior, older generation of leadership in the PLA, and it shouldn't be ignored.
Well, if long memories are a characteristic of Chinese strategic thinking, disinformation, at least in the U.S., hasn't created too many long memories. We're pretty much dealing with it on a transactional basis. Barnett, what have you been thinking about in terms of disinformation and how it affects the U.S. and other countries in terms of cyber?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love that question, but very, very quickly before I do, I just want to highlight for hopefully the senior leaders in the audience and everyone else that Tomas's remarks initially, right? The Baltic countries are way out in front on this issue, and the U.S. government should be paying attention to what's going on there. All right, so with that plug in, let me return to your question. And so I think one thing that I've been focusing on quite a bit is sort of how disinformation plays out in sort of different theaters for Russia. And I've in thinking through this, I've broken it down into sort of Russia's near abroad, so what's going on in the Baltics, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Georgia, and so on and so forth. And this is a theater where Russia has options, or at least potentially has options, right? They can project more conventional military force into Eastern Europe, and indeed they have done so in places like Georgia and Ukraine. Nevertheless, they've still chosen to rely heavily on disinformation, either to sort of increase the level of ambiguity over who's at fault, who's responsible when there are sort of Russian SOF or Russian general purpose forces crossing international borders, or in sort of the Baltics, in lieu of sort of using kinetic military force because it's cheaper to do so. They don't want to risk a NATO response, would be my guess there. And also the Baltic countries have invested heavily in this sort of total defense concept, which would mean even on their own, they could make the Russians suffer if there were a more conventional invasion. But the second sort of theater is the obvious one that we all talk about on a regular basis as Americans, and this is the U.S. And I think Gofo made a really good point about how detailed of an understanding the GRU and others in FSB and SVR that are engaging in this space have of the extant cleavages in American society. And so I got asked about from one of my students a few years ago after the 2016 presidential election, were the Russians successful or not? And it really depends on what they were trying to achieve. And I'm not entirely certain as to what they were trying to achieve. It's possible they were trying to ensure a Trump victory, in which case I would argue that no, they were not successful insofar as the best unclassified evidence I've seen suggests that they minimally actually influenced the course of that election. If, however, they were just trying to further divide the American populace, then absolutely they were successful because we're still asking that same question today, and we're still talking about Russian election interference in the United States. In 2020, I would assume, and I don't have firm evidence to back this up, so take it with a grain of salt, I would assume that the Russian Federation recognized that they may not have had a pronounced effect on the 2016 election outcomes, and my guess would be that the goal, therefore, was simply to continue to foment or exacerbate unrest in the United States. And a weakened United States that's focused on internal issues is absolutely a victory for the Russian Federation. I think the third theater is our near abroad, or at least places that are far away from Russia. And so I've looked extensively at Latin America. So most people, a few people on this call know this, but most people don't realize this, but I'm a bad Latin Americanist by training. That was my early sort of educational formation, and I've got sucked in many different other directions. But in looking at sort of Russian operations in the information environment in Latin America, they've become really, really sophisticated. And one sort of data point I'd like to point to is that the Russian media outlets provide content to over 300 television providers in the Western Hemisphere. And importantly, we're not just talking about Sputnik and Espanol or RT and Espanol. We're talking about content that looks and feels local because they'll pay to hire a local Ecuadorian newscaster. They'll produce mostly local interest stories that are totally benign, but mixed in there, you get 10% of content that is in influence operation. And it's virtually undetectable because these agreements they have with the TV stations are very well hidden. I mean, if you're a lawyer and you want to go through 18 shell companies, you might be able to figure it out, but the average consumer isn't. And it doesn't say RT or Sputnik at the bottom of the screen. And so I think this sort of gets back to the first point I made about how we ought to be leveraging some of Tomas's experience and sort of the Baltic experience in general for a whole of society approach, because unfortunately, technical means to counter disinformation is very much, in my opinion, a gun armor race, right? We've observed since at least the 1990s that the cost of tank armor has increased at an exponentially greater rate than anti-tank guided munitions. The same is absolutely true, if not even more pronounced, when it comes to the technical skills and platforms to deliver misinformation versus to automate the detection and defense against that. What we instead need to be doing is inoculating our populations, making them better and more informed consumers of information. And that's the only way you win. And I think that finding is the same across all three of these theaters that I mentioned: at home in the United States, in Russia's near abroad, and in our near abroad. Unfortunately, Russia's near abroad has become more sophisticated at doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Barnett, and thanks to everyone for your excellent and insightful comments on this and all the other topics we've discussed this morning. I think now we can move to the question and answer period, and we'll look forward to hearing and responding to any questions from members of the audience. Let's start off the Q&A period, picking up on the topic that Dr. Alexopoulos mentioned earlier, and that is the NATO view of responses to any cyber attacks. You know, cyber deterrence is a huge topic. We probably could have an entire panel just on that. And it's important for the United States because until the 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Cyber Strategy, we have never really had a declaratory policy about how we would respond to cyber attacks against the United States. You know, we've tried naming and shaming. We've indicted a few Russian hackers, and when they take vacations to countries that have extradition treaties with the United States, we even managed to arrest some of them, try them, and put them in jail. We've also indicted Chinese PLA officers for their operations against the United States. And so this naming and shaming response, plus sanctions against Russia, China, and Iran, are about the main things we've done so far. We now have a declaratory policy that says we're going to do more than that. And I think that might have been a reflection of, or perhaps reflected in, what Golfo heard from her NATO colleagues. So Golfo, let me ask you to expand on that if you would please, and then I'll open it up to the others on the panel to respond.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that we hosted the NATO Secretary General at USF just last week, and one of our alums, who is a soldier and he works at MacDill, asked the question of whether or not NATO would reconsider its red line for triggering Article 5. And the Secretary General said that, in fact, the last couple of years, they've been pretty open about their thinking that cyber attacks could be so debilitating and so serious that they would they would be tantamount to a conventional attack. So I think that we've already crossed over into that realm where cyber could, trigger a real kinetic confrontation. So I think it's something that It would be interesting to just hear some of the others on this panel about this problem.
Great. Benham, your thoughts, please.
I think it's fascinating that we're still struggling with cyber power as a continuum of war, or at what point does cyber conflict become cyber war? Because our adversaries are struggling with it too, but they may have in this case more clearly established thresholds again that we have to infer because there's no smoking gun kind of evidence, but are consistent with a broader pattern of behavior. So in this case, looking at the Iran example, something that the U.S. doesn't do well on Iran broadly is deterrence by punishment. Lots of scholars have focused about the military capabilities the U.S. has to offset the Iranians, so that's deterrence by denial, a missile defense against a missile. But deterrence by punishment, the impression of the resolve we've given may not be as clear. In the cyber domain, I think more cyber activity rather than less may actually correct for this. And I'll give you an example. 2019 and 2020. In 2019, you had the U.S. really step down from the use of force in response to overt kinetic actions by the Iranians, particularly the summer of 2019 in response to the downing of the drone. At that point, President Trump stood back from launching an attack on Iranian SAM site in Iran. But later on, 2-3 weeks out, it was revealed that the U.S. had used a cyber attack against an Iranian missile control facility. Summer of 2020, for instance, there was tons of allegations about Israeli cyber and other kind of sabotage activities across Iran's nuclear plants, scientific research centers, and centrifuge production facilities. So in this case, perhaps if the U.S. and Iran remain in this strategic competition, the answer is may not lie in codifying something in doctrine, but finding a commensurate cyber offset to signal or make up for our deficit in deterrence by punishment as that actor continues their activities in the overt space. So for instance, because it is apparent now, at least in the open source, that the type of cyber-enabled economic warfare that Iran used to engage in against U.S. critical infrastructure and in particular financial institutions is not what it used to be. It's shifted more towards targeting, at least again, based on open source, Israel and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, some other more localized U.S. partners, and then we can unpack that maybe that the U.S. can find a cyber offset for some of the things that Iran is doing, such as terrorism, missile testing, missile transferring, evolving its asymmetric capabilities. So there is a lot more of a there for Washington to get involved in this space. It's risky, for sure. It may run up against several other areas of ours that we may have more clearly established red lines or rules of engagement vis-a-vis the Iranians. But I think that's the kind of creativity that is going to have to be needed. Thanks. I hope that answered the question. That was a bit more circuitous.
It's good. It's all good. Tomas, as a key NATO member, Lithuania must have a view on this question. How do you interpret the comments that Golfo heard from the NATO representatives? What does that mean?
Actually, I believe that experts in this field were working towards this kind of understanding a pretty long time. And definitely it's a kind of new topic, despite the fact that we see real events in our countries and overall in the NATO environment. But this is, I believe, the same as comparison with unmanned plane and manned plane. Plenty of unmanned airplanes were hit and grounded, but later on there is no, let's say, very visible and very strong political reaction from one or another country. But if a planned plane would, let's say, cross our borders, it definitely will be let's say, huge political international, let's say, debate and maybe beginning of the military conflict. So I believe that we need to put more effort in, let's say, advertising issue and challenge which we have here in the cyber, let's say, environment, in information environment, and other hybrid approach, let's say, directions.
Thanks. I believe NATO has discussed this before, their potential response to any cyber operations. I believe there was a Wales conference some years ago, and I was on a panel actually at New York University in Abu Dhabi in 2013, I believe it was, where a representative who had attended that conference said that NATO would consider invoking Article 5, that is, an attack against one is an attack against all, for cyber attacks, but they would do that in a tailored case-by-case basis. Has that thinking changed, Golfo, do you think, or is this just a revisiting of what they had previously discussed?
So that sounds quite right to me, Terry. The NATO Secretary General said that he would not indicate when that would happen. He doesn't want to specify, but he leaves open the possibility. So I think they don't want to, reveal too much to our adversaries, but to say that we're prepared to respond militarily if a cyber attack, crosses that threshold to be, really serious.
And Bernard, what do you think this means in terms of the United States, in terms particularly of the national strategy, security strategy, and the national cyber strategy, where we do have, for the first time, a declaratory policy about cyber deterrence?
So, Terry, if I could just quickly tag into what Golfo just said, I know I'm here as a China person, but though I war game in a lot of other spaces, and this is unclassified mostly, so I'll talk around it a little bit. But there was a game a couple of years ago where a cyber-enabled operation that was hypothesized did lead to a fictional Article 5 consultation, and it was because the hypothesized operation took down SatNav in Western Europe, and so there were lawyers involved in this game, and their hypothesis was that deaths, believe it or not, as a result of accidents caused by a deliberate operation to disable internet-based navigation tools, satellite-enabled navigation tools, constituted potentially, arguably, civilian casualties of armed conflict. And so their opinion was you were on firm legal ground to start your Article 5 consultation on that basis alone. And obviously, in general, something like taking down all of the, SatNav in Germany and France would be pretty aggressive in the first place. So.
Good, thank you. So Burnett, back to you, if you could please comment a little bit on what all this means for U.S. deterrence and policy and potential responses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Behram made some good points here that I just want to tease out in answering that question. And so Behram was talking about sort of a proportional, probably cyber response as opposed to a response in another domain. And I think that's an important aspect here, right? The US and the West more generally still like to think in sort of binary terms, right? We have this war-peace duality. Russia and China, for that matter, don't think like that, right? For them, there's a continuum of competition, and it's always occurring. And there were efforts, including some that I was involved with for SOCOM, to sort of reset U.S. thinking and come up with something that's a little bit more flexible and has more gradations. But nevertheless, I think the average sort of senior leader, but also equally importantly, the average American, just general population, thinks in sort of this war-peace duality, in terms of that duality. And I think that's really important, right? Because I don't think you're going to convince the American public that the vast majority of cyber attacks rise to the level of war. I can hypothesize exceptions. So, for example, the GRU attack on the Ukrainian power grid, or actually there were multiple, if that had happened in the US, and indeed it could have happened in the US because the same malicious code was detected in the US electric grid, that would have, like Devin was said, killed Americans. Not necessarily at the end of a rifle, but due to hospitals losing power and having limited backup power supplies, and so on and so forth. You can extrapolate and get to a decent death toll. But short of that, short of something catastrophic like that, I don't see the U.S. public or U.S. senior leaders being willing to risk escalation and engage with special operations forces, engage with precision strike capabilities, and so on and so forth. So I think it's especially important that a more nuanced set of measures for cyber engagement be developed. And admittedly, some of that very likely exists, although that crosses into a classified discussion very, very quickly. So I will step back from that. I think on the NATO front, one important point, though, is a lot of our NATO allies are highly dependent on Russian oil and gas. So if this is going to be a multilateral response as opposed to a U.S. response, the point I just made about this war-peace duality needs to be, it becomes even more impactful, right? This is going to need to be a calibrated cyber response that limits the risk that Russia shuts off the heating fuel to huge segments of the Western European public. And that's a really hard problem to deal with, unfortunately. And indeed, Russian I.O. routinely targets sort of NATO and tries to increase divisions over these other issues. And then I think the final issue that really hampers senior leaders' ability to make informed decisions in this space is we don't necessarily know what we even did to precipitate the initial action that we perceive as aggressive by Russia or China or Iran. And so I'm running, and a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, but I'm co-editing and co-authoring a series with the Modern War Institute at West Point and the RV Cyber Institute, where we're getting sort of top leaders from industry, academia, and government to talk about what they think are the most pressing issues in short, sort of like 2,000-word sound bites each week. And we had a piece a couple of weeks ago looking at overclassification in U.S. cyber. And the effect is that even the senior leadership is not fully aware necessarily of the full spectrum of what the U.S. is doing offensively in this space. So we see the Iranians, as Beham mentioned, down a U.S. drone, and we're coming up with a response there too, without realizing necessarily that we launched a cyber attack that predated that downing of the drone that resulted in that action by Iran. And that is really, really scary. And I apologize, I don't have a solution to this, but this is a hard problem that we should be thinking about, and I think is especially important to senior leaders watching this.
Right. One of the key things in solving problems is to identify them. So I think you did a good job of outlining some problems that we need more thought about.
Terry, super quick footnote to what Barnett just said. It was very interesting. And I realized I forgot to make this point in the initial panel, the first part of the comments. May I?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yes, Barnett would also mention a good point about, did we do something to precipitate it? I always say, don't denude our near peer competitor or regional competitor of agency, because this tends to happen grossly in the Iran debate. I don't know if it happens a lot in the Russia or China debate. It's true in the cyber domain, and it's true in the overt or more kinetic domain. These actors, again, going back to the first part, have a worldview where even if there is something that is not done, the persistence of a policy, the persistence of even a talking point may be sufficient for some of these countries to be responding to us or trying to offset us or land the blow against us in the cyber domain. So, I'm sure Iran is one of the most surveilled countries when it comes to drones. I'm sure there's lots of drones in international waters around Iran as we speak. It would make sense given the threat. But the Iranian decision to respond against that has both proximate and root causes. And the root cause, of course, cannot be divorced from the proximate one, which could be a tit for tat. But the root causes, of course, they see themselves as locked in this competition. They are seeking to overchange the balance of power. And they see the persistence of U.S. policy in one area and the locking in of the regional balance as something that we've done intentionally against them. So their worldview is the X to the Y. And that just needs to be kind of kept in mind if we're going to look at the proximate causes as well. So not disagreeing with my good friend in public, but also just adding this point to it.
Thank you, Benham. Moving on to another question. One of the live issues in Washington right now is the government's responsibility for responding to cyber attacks against private companies. This, of course, came up after the SolarWinds attack and has been an issue around town for a long time about authorities and responsibilities of government cyber defense for the private sector. I, in my class, teach a segment on national cyber strategies, and it's interesting to look at many different countries and how they approach this topic. It takes a long time to get all the stakeholders involved in a national cyber strategy involved, and then to get them sort of moving in the same direction about what the national strategy should include. Does it focus only on cyber? Does it include national security? Does it talk about threats? Are there action items in it? And most importantly, who is in charge? I frequently tell students that the most difficult things about any national cyber strategy are, number one, implementing it after you've finally gotten it written down, and number two, who's in charge? Because many countries have their own views of this. Organizations within countries have already, in many cases, started their own cyber efforts and initiatives, and don't take kindly, in some cases, to a national authority coming on the scene and trying to take over cyber policy. I know in Lithuania, speaking with Tomasz previously, that they have a very good model for this, and I think, as he'll tell you, it took a long time to get to where they are today. But for me, it's a good case study in National Organization for Cyber Defense. And so, Tomasz, I'd like to ask you if you wouldn't mind to share that with the crowd, with the audience.
Yes, just a couple of points about cyber defense in Lithuania. And definitely it was a very long way for us. And for almost 20 or 30 years, we were looking who might be responsible for cyber defense in the country. Different structures and different ministries were created, and we tried to solve this challenge. But sometimes it was lack of experience, sometimes it was lack of motivation. We tried to do it, let's say, in a bureaucratical way only. And finally, we in Lithuania understood that if we are talking about defense, if we are talking about cyber war, if we are talking about cyber operations, so probably the best way is to put in the Ministry of Defense and the responsibility of Ministry of Defense. For the sake of democracy, definitely civilian part of Ministry of Defense is responsible for these activities. And now these changes we already have for 3 years, and till now it looks that it really works. And second step was definitely all the time observe our policies and securing also strategy for cyber defense. And again, everything is so quickly changing in this environment. So just this month, we'll again upgrade our, let's say, law system on the cyber defense issues. Also, National Cyber Security Center is established, and we have plenty of different responsibilities from education, also some preventive actions. There is programs and tools how different private companies who are running their business through internet, web pages, social media, they can check their, let's say, security procedures and tools which they are using. And also monitoring of the situation, analysis of cyber incidents, and later on investigation on these incidents. Also, we have cybersecurity committee meetings twice per year, where different entities from the country they gather in one place. So this is a governmental domain, this is a public sector, this is scientists, this is private companies who are dealing with this issue. And they trying to share experience, they trying to understand the most important problem in this field, and later on they helping each other in order to solve these problems. Also, one of the pretty, I would say, good products, we are doing reports open for the society about cybersecurity situation in the country. And we already do it for 5 years. And again, it's very valuable. Our citizens, they can read about it. And together with overall intelligence agencies, open reports for the society and informational security reports, so they can get an expression where are we in 21st century in Lithuania and in our region.
Okay, Tomasz, thank you very much. I think we can all learn a lot of lessons, as Barnett said earlier, from all your neighbors, Latvia and Estonia, as well as Lithuania, and how you are handling cyber defense and how you are dealing with being on the front line of the disinformation coming from your neighbor to the east. I'd like to ask one more question, and it's something that the thought was triggered in me from a comment that Benham made and also Devin, talking about essentially collaboration between these countries. We tend to look at China, Russia, and Iran as individual actors in the cyber threat arena, and certainly they are. But there does seem to be some indications of collaboration between, at least on a bilateral basis, between, for example, China and Iran, and Russia and Iran, and perhaps Russia and China. So with the expertise we have on the panel, I think we might be able to learn a lot about your thinking on how this collaboration works, whether it's meaningful, and whether it portends even a greater cyber threat for the U.S. If these countries collaborate and combine their forces in cyber operations against us. I'm not quite sure who to start with, so I'll open that up to whoever wants to go first. It looks like Devin. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Terry. Just before I move into that question, I'll quickly say what Tomasz was saying, and that, you know, as in so many other fields, especially with what we've talked about already with the freedom of speech space versus the closed internet space, we have policy issues and legal issues when it comes to doing that part in the United States, right? Your Title 10, Title 50 questions, you know, we've constrained ourselves in our ability to regulate our own cyber defense, I think unintentionally and almost 100 years ago, right? But, you know, the debate needs to update. On the question, personal take only, the Chinese are not tremendously good collaborators in the international defense space. I don't believe that they are genuinely interested in assisting the Iranian regime in any way that doesn't relate directly to their main interests in Iran, which are energy security and regional influence, right? So to the extent that they can serve as technology propagators and, you know, assist their own short-term interests, I believe that they will, but I don't see that as a opportunity where there's going to become a strategic partnership or alliance against the United States. Behnam may disagree with me, but that's just not their behavior pattern, right? They're not good at forming alliances to begin with. Right? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is basically the only international organization, other than when they got to take Taiwan's seat from the UN, that the CCP has ever had any interest in really being invested in. And it's basically just a Belt and Road Initiative sales job plus a counterterrorism training opportunity to work with the Russian special forces, to train their own special forces to be better at what are honestly actually domestic suppression tools. So I would be skeptical of an argument that you would see a long-term strategic cyber partnership between Iran and China aimed at the United States. I think it would be transactional, exploitative, and that would be the model you see. And in fact, if you want to talk about Moscow, same thing, only with a bad history, right? Beijing and Moscow did not get along during the Cold War. That was part of, the Kissinger strategy, right? They're not notably closer now. I think in reality, there are opportunities that both take to be on the same team in front of a camera, but I don't really believe that there's a serious positive relationship there either. And,
right, and they have used, I think, they have used that relationship in front of the UN by submitting strategies on cyber treaties through the SCO organization to the UN in 2011 and revised slightly in 2015. So more for propaganda and ideology purposes, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, the SCO is a touch point for them as well for this collaborative, veneer, but I think it's a veneer.
Okay. How about other comments?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ben.
I'll be brief. This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but what I am very attuned to is that there are sort of deep-seating tensions and a heightened level of mistrust amongst Russian leaders that I think is mutual with both some of their Chinese and their Iranian counterparts. So while I can definitely see some sort of tactical, concrete utility to collaboration in a couple of key areas, I would be skeptical that this becomes sort of deeply ingrained and huge and sort of wide-reaching and seriously problematic. And I know we often get headlines in the U.S. about sort of Iran-Russia partnership or Russia-China partnership. We should be very afraid. And I think those are overblown. And I think that applies to cyber as well as other domains. And I'll stop there. I'm sure Vietnam has something more detailed to add.
Only slightly. There's a kind of a Papa Bear, Mama Bear, Baby Bear approach to this. And it's the Iranians, too, have had a tough time with alliances. Even, you're looking around the region, it's the Assad regime is their only regional partner when it comes to a state. So when you look upwards and eastwards, Russia and China, Iran does have a bit more of that exploitative history vis-a-vis the Russians. You talk about long history for the past half millennia. No country has done more damage to Iran's national interests or taken away more territory than the Russians and the czarist, communist, and present incarnations. But to unpack that further, I think there is space for transactions between both the Russians and the Chinese vis-a-vis the Iranians. And I think that space is going to be particularly robust on cyber defense or detecting for the Iranians where there are intrusions in their systems. Obviously, everyone knows all the things that have been reported in the open source about Iranian hackers and Russian hackers going at cross purposes sometimes. That stuff can happen. I don't think any of these agreements, particularly the one that was agreed to with Zarif and Lavrov just this January, that will not prevent, that will not upset. But I think there will be the potential for, hardening, quote unquote, Iran cyber defenses. This has been talked about a lot. And if the regime really tries to harden its defenses to try to make sure that this new domain, this non-kinetic domain that, the Israelis or the Americans or anyone else may be looking to exploit, it makes sure that it's not ripe for them to exploit or not as ripe for them to exploit. This could be, I think, mutually beneficial. The Iranians might look for it as a way to strengthen their cyber defenses. The Russians, or if the Chinese are involved at some point later on, may look to detect, bugs, malware, worms, viruses, vectors of intrusion that Washington or its partners may use against a partner of its own. So it could be in that way a learning capability, mutually beneficial that way. But I agree there is a strong amount of mistrust between the two. The thing is that on the military space and the political space, the force overcoming the mistrust is the again, agency on behalf of the Iranian leadership, the willingness to be the junior partner that may not have existed before. Iranians haven't been able to procure some weapon systems even before multilateral arms embargoes from the UN vis-a-vis the Russians, because they were, insisting on production on their own territory, or they also would not relegate themselves to being a junior partner. I think the founding motto of the Islamic Republic used to be neither East nor West Islamic Republic. I think now it's to keep the Islamic Republic go East to offset the West. And I think that's where you're likely going to see a lot of high-level interest. Even the way that the regime elites, particularly IRGC, talks about Russia and China is different. So again, I think it could be a beginning for something. It's not an end-all, be-all. So I would expect much more in terms of the public space of these Russia-Iran cyber agreements to come. But I think they're going to be focused on defenses and short to medium-term areas where they can both benefit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. I think we'll wrap up our part of the Q&A now, and if there's an opportunity for some live Q&A, we'll go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I want to just make a couple of closing remarks here. Robert Conquest, who was a famous Russian and Soviet historian, used to make a comment in conferences like this that we really need to open our minds because the Russians don't think like us. We do a lot of mirror imaging and imputing their motives the same as we would think about cyber operations or any other type of national security and foreign policy activity, but they have a different perspective. And I think what we've heard today is the same is true for the Chinese and Iranians. So hopefully what we've gotten from this amazing discussion today is a better understanding of the context for cyber operations for Russia, China, and Iran. And I think it's good for all of us to think about the political, economic, and military dimensions of cyber operations whenever they appear or occur from these countries. I want to thank our amazing panelists for your insightful and helpful comments. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else on the call took away a lot of valuable insights from your discussion. So thank you all very much, and we'll close the panel at this point.
So that concludes the first day of our conference. I have to tell you, it was chock full of sound bites and quotes. I hope our reporters are busy scribbling in the back room. And the content to me was just dynamite. We heard from everybody who's anybody in the cybersecurity business. That's just our first day. The second day is even more to come. But I want to thank our speakers again, Lieutenant Governor Nunez, Dr. Carell, General Wolf, Mike McConnell, my boss, General Nakasone, our panels this afternoon, our moderators. It was just wonderful. So stay tuned for even more tomorrow. In the meantime, catch your breath, take a break, and we'll see you bright and early in the morning. Thanks.